You may have come across Jack in the Green before. You might also have encountered the Green Man. But who or what are these strange figures, and what exactly do they have in common, if anything? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. I hope that this episode finds you well. I pretty much hope that every single week, but I think at the moment I hope it a little bit more than usual. So I do hope that you are well and that everybody that you know is well, and that the worst thing that you have to deal with is boredom. But that is why I'm here, to try and brighten up your day in any way that I can. Now this week we are going to have a look at Jack in the Green, and I'm not going to lie, I didn't really know what Jack in the Green was. I'd heard the name before in a book that I will mention later on, and I thought it was something very different. And when I started doing the research, as often happens when I do these episodes, I discovered that actually everything I thought I knew was bollocks, and I needed to do a lot more digging. And I know just from the sheer length of the blog post that this episode is based on, that this may be a little bit longer than usual episodes, and it may also be that it sounds like I'm going in one direction but I'm actually going to be going in another, so just stick with it until the end and hopefully you'll enjoy it. And it has meant looking at two different things and trying to see if there is actually a link between them, and the Jack in the Green part was actually a request from a listener, so that was basically where it started from, and I went down a bit of a rabbit hole, so I hope that you enjoy it. So without any further ado, let's get on with this week's episode. So if you head to Hastings in Kent for their May Day celebrations, you will at some point see a huge May Day parade, although granted not in 2020, but in previous years this would absolutely have been the case. And you may see Morris dancers plying their trade alongside a person who appears to be dressed as a giant Christmas tree. He's not, but this person is known as the Jack in the Green. And who or what is this strange figure? Some people think that he represents an ancient force of nature, other people think he seems to represent the spirit of the woods, and other people confuse him with the mythical Green Man who is apparently found in churches all over England. So this is basically what we're delving into. So we're going to start off with the Jack in the Green. And as I say, basically, if you can try to start this episode off, and I want you to imagine with me. Imagine a guy who is basically wearing what looks like a wooden frame and it's covered in foliage and branches and so on. And as I say, looks like a Christmas tree without the baubles and all the glitter and the tinsel and everything. Okay? That's the mental image that I want you to have. And this is the Jack in the Green. And according to Rossano, we can trace his origins back to the 16th and 17th centuries. And it was at this point that people started to make garlands to mark basically the onset of summer. And over time, these got more and more elaborate. And nearly every article that you will read online about the Jack in the Green will talk about the milkmaids and their increasingly complicated garlands for the May Day celebrations. And they used to use a lot of silver in theirs. And they ended up in a weird sort of competition with the chimney sweeps. And by the 18th century, the chimney sweeps garlands had become so big that they would actually cover the man entirely, hence the modern version that looks, as I say, like a Christmas tree. And as I say, this is basically when the traditional design comes in. So the guy's walking around wearing this frame on his upper half. And the first documented mention of a Jack in the Green comes from the late 1700s. I've seen two different dates mentioned. One person said 1775, someone else said 1785. But basically we can argue it was after 1770. And across the next century or so, the sweeps take this tradition of the Jack in the Green across the south of England. Now, Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud in the Dictionary of English Folklore note that this was basically quite a regionalised custom and that most of the appearances happened in London, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire. And this basically could explain why I'd never heard of it up here in Northumberland until somebody asked for it. And there's not really a huge amount to really talk about with the Jack in the Green at this point. It's just this guy would appear in the parades wearing this particular cage. And the Victorians are often accused of inventing links back to this distant pagan past, such as the alleged link between the Roman festival of Lupercalia and St. Valentine's Day. And in this case, we're going to have to absolve them of such guilt, because I don't really think that they are responsible for these backwards links with Jack in the Green. And basically, whoever played the Jack used to be quite bawdy, and there'd often be quite vulgar antics surrounding him. And the Victorians actually tamed this and then reintroduced them again as a much more family-friendly version that could take place in their various pageants. Now, Victorian sensibilities, and let's be honest, they're not exactly famous for their sense of humour, they weren't the only factor in the decline of the Jack in the Green. And in 1875, the Chimney Sweepers Act passed through Parliament, which is a good thing because it meant that small boys could no longer be forced to work up chimneys. And considering the fact that some sweeps were as young as 4, I mean, I think that's absolutely horrific that you would send this 4-year-old child up a chimney. It just doesn't bear thinking about. But partly because of that, and partly due to the new registration regulations for sweeps, it basically had a knock-on effect on the Jack in the Green tradition, because obviously it was them that dressed up as him. And by the 1900s, the custom had largely died out. Now, I actually went looking for this on the British Newspaper Archive, and I found a short article from the 3rd of May in 1904 in the London Daily News, and they basically insisted that the spectacle of Jack in the Green was actually out of date, and they thought it was because London was too busy. But either way, by 1904, it was pretty much on the way out. Only, as I think you've gathered by now, if you're a long-term listener, you can't keep a good folk tradition down. And towns like Knutsford, Brentham and Oxford all attempted to revive the custom, although at the time it didn't necessarily catch the public imagination the way that it has now. And it wasn't until 1976 that the people of Whitstable in Kent actually successfully resurrected the tradition, and then Rochester and Hastings followed suit, Hastings being in 1983, and they're now famous for their annual May Day parade, so much so that they're actually on Atlas Obscura talking about the parade. And for some people, as I said earlier, the Jack in the Green represents an ancient nature god, and for others he's basically a bit of a fun English quirk, and spoiler alert, it's pretty much more of the latter. There's not really any reason to think that he's an old remnant of earlier pagan customs, so we're going to have a quick look at where this link may or may not come from. And when you're kicking around the internet looking for these kind of things, you might actually also come across talk of the Green Man as well as Jack in the Green. And this is basically where things start to get confusing, because the Green Man refers to two separate things. So if you've ever seen Morris men's celebrations, you may have seen one man dressed entirely in green, and he's often called the Green Man, which is fair enough, but the Essex Morris men sometimes describe their Green Man as being Jack in the Green. So far, so confusing. And secondly, you may or may not, depending on how much you hang out in Old English churches, have seen sort of carvings of like a face emerging from foliage. It's often as if like sort of eyes surrounded by like oak leaves and things like that. And they're also called the Green Man. Although we are going to come back to that particular point in a moment. And some people will claim an ancient connection between these two things, that both the Jack in the Green, played by the Chimney Sweeps, and the Green Man, appearing in the churches, both represent the onset of summer. And they both do and they don't. And we'll come back to that again as well. Now, Simpson and Roud actually point out an even earlier usage of the term Green Man, and they explain that during the Tudor era, men were employed to drive back crowds from the road to let processions pass through, so you can basically think of them as a 16th century form of crowd control. And these men were called whifflers, which is possibly the best job description ever, and they wore costumes. And according to Simpson and Roud, the ones who wore shaggy hair were called savage or wild men, and the ones covered in leaves were, you guessed it, the Green Men. Now, Brandon Centerwall actually talks about this version of the Green Man quite extensively. Now, he explains how they're actually referred to in plays as early as 1594, so they do predate the Jack in the Green by quite some margin. So you do have to wonder, are they indeed one and the same? And in a word, no, they're not. Well, probably not. And again, we're going to come back to that one. Hopefully you can see quite why it took me so long to write this post, because it got a bit confusing trying to unpick everything. But that is what I'm here for, and hopefully this will be making sense to you so far. But this is also the point where we need to go back to the carved faces in churches that we discussed earlier. And as I say, you often find them in old churches. In some cases, they're the only piece of decoration in the place. And I do actually have a picture on my blog of the version from Nell Latimer's Commonplace Oracle deck, which if you like using tarot cards and oracle cards, I highly recommend. And in this particular one, again, it's this face essentially made out of oak leaves and so on. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And these carvings are actually referred to as Folliate heads. That's their correct name. And they can basically be found all over churches from the Norman and Gothic period. And the design first arrived in England from France in the 12th century, and they were a form of grotesque. And grotesques are essentially just ornaments of some description. Just as a total side issue, but just because it irritates me when I say it being used wrong. Sometimes people use grotesque and gargoyle interchangeably. Gargoyles are actually the water spouts. So if something sticks out the side of the church and it basically lets water off the roof and then away from the wall, it's a gargoyle. If it's just a carving, it's a grotesque. Total side issue, but there you go. That is your fun fact of the day. Anyway, back to the Green Man. So these particular grotesques, and as I say, imagine a man's face, eyes, sometimes a mouth, sometimes not, some kind of foliage going on as well. And these particular grotesques are called Romanesque in Europe and Norman in England. And their European name, Romanesque, basically comes from the fact that they reflect the leaf masks that were found on late Roman art. And in these cases, they represent gods or supernatural beings, according to Simpson and Roud. So there's not one singular style. There's also no singular title, which makes it a bit more difficult to refer to them. And as Simpson and Roud point out, it's also really unlikely that they all meant the same thing because they're so different. And Simpson and Roud go on to point out that they may have once supported medieval sculpture, such as the statues of saints, but then during the Reformation, when the statue was removed, only the head survived, and basically they've then been given this independent importance that they were never intended to have. So we're reading something into what's left rather than what was originally there. Now that is just Simpson and Roud's reading of the situation, but I do think that they do have a valuable point there that we don't necessarily know why the carvings were put there in the first place, so we can't necessarily know what they mean, if that makes sense. Now, this is where it all goes a little bit pear-shaped. And in 1939, Lady Raglan wrote a piece for the Folklore Journal in which she applied the phrase Green Man to these Folliate heads. And she assumed that the artists had been recreating what they'd seen in everyday life, and she believed that this was some kind of spring fertility ritual that they'd seen involving the Jack and the Green, and that they were representing this tradition in their carvings. Now, the complete and utter lack of evidence to support this assumption has been neatly ignored by everyone who now repeats as fact the link between Folliate heads and a wilder pagan past. I'm not going to lie, I was one of them. Up until I did this episode, I firmly believed what everyone had said, that these green men were like a cheeky nod by the stonemasons to their own pagan beliefs, not their Christian ones. So I was a little bit disappointed to discover that no, they were actually part of this Romanesque art tradition. But this is the point I'm getting at with this particular episode, that sometimes you hear things and people just repeat things that they have heard, and there's not necessarily anything to back them up. So it always behooves you to do your research, or let me do it for you. But anyway, it was Lady Raglan that made this erroneous connection between the Green Man and these Folliate heads and the Jack and the Green by assuming that they were one and the same thing. Now, this is basically where I then come into this, if this makes sense, because the witchcraft author Marion Green actually talks about the Jack and the Green, and she describes them as, I quote, an ancient traditional figure, a spirit of the wild wood and a younger son of Pan, god of the animal kingdom, although we usually see him as an old man, end quote. Now, for Green, Jack and the Green Man in old churches are one and the same, and yes, that is a confusing sentence for me to say as well as here. And here, she's basically ascribed a whole background to Jack and the Green that isn't actually present in the original version by the Chimney Sweeps as they were trying to outdo the Milkmaids. Now, this is where I first encountered Jack and the Green. So in my head, I assumed that Jack and the Green was this ancient spirit of the wildwood, and that's why he appears the way that he does in churches. So if you were thinking the same thing, so was I until I looked into this. But in Marion Green's defence, I don't think she's done this by accident, because in 1967, ROM and H.M. Carter wrote an article in Folklore again, in which they designated a specific type of the Folliate head as a Jack in the Green. And this refers to, and I quote, a human face, generally young, seldom or never grotesque, peeping out from surrounding foliage, end quote. Now this one, while it's a bit of a weird association, at the same time you can actually see a link between this description and the chimney sweep peeping out of his massive cage of leaves. But that is where the similarity ends. If the Jack in the Green is this figure from the May Day celebrations and basically the guilds competing with each other, there's not really any link with these Folliate heads in churches. But they're not the only ones exploring these ideas, both the Carters and Marion Green. And an article in the Hull Daily Mail from 1899 actually summarised a lecture at Newcastle's Lytton Phil by Mr. A. Ferguson about the Jack in the Green. And the article goes way further than any of these other things that I've already looked at, and raises the spectre of sympathetic magic and animism, explaining that, and I quote, when a tree was cut down, the spirit of the tree was supposed to be offended and something had to be provided for it to go into, end quote. Now here, the Jack in the Green becomes that alternative home for the tree spirit, not a part of a May Day celebration, so it's kind of almost like basically a substitute home for the tree spirit, which if you're familiar with Greek mythology, you'll know as the Hamadryads. But here, the Jack becomes, and I quote, the god of cultivation, end quote. But it's interesting how there is this continual link between the Jack in the Green and some ancient pagan past, but there's not really any evidence to actually back this up. Or is there? I'm gonna give you a lifeline, because I know I was looking for one, because I was starting to get quite disappointed at this point. But who is the Green Man if he's not Jack in the Green? Now, Brandon Centerwall does argue that the term Green Man is actually the correct one for these Folliate heads, because he actually thinks that the whifflers, so these are the men who were dressed up in green to push the crowds back so processions could get through, he thinks that they were dressed the way that they were to actually represent the leafy heads that you would find in churches, which isn't the most bonkers thing I've ever heard, but it's in his head these whifflers are then basically in fancy dress as these heads that they would see in churches. So where Lady Raglan assumed that the wood carvers had been representing some kind of ritual, Centerwall is like, yes, the carvers are absolutely recreating something from everyday life, but it's not got this ritualistic element, it's just more kind of pageantry, if anything else. I don't know. We'll leave that one with Centerwall to decide whether that's right or wrong. But it's just the fact that he has tried to link the Green Man in all of his foliage with the Green Man in the carvings, and as I say, it's not the most logical opinion to come to. But let's go back to Jack in the Green for a moment, because obviously this is basically, he started all of this off. So it is really quite hard to see how an annual competition between milkmaids and chimney sweeps then turned into this god of cultivation. And I don't necessarily think that there is a link between the two. However, there is a tiny point of commonality that I think is worth bearing in mind. And this is that the Victorians toned down their Jack in the Green because of his really over-the-top behaviour. And Centerwall actually notes that the antics of the whiffler suggested bacchanalian revelry. So while the Jack in the Green doesn't directly represent the Green Man, they both seem to descend from a very similar human impulse to enjoy a parade or two. So I did quite like that tiny little link there between the two, that they basically just liked having some fun and japes. So I do think that we can probably agree at this point that the Jack in the Green should be separated from the Green Man, because the Jack in the Green does become part of the May Day celebration, so he does represent the start of summer. So that's where I was saying at the beginning, yes and no, he does do that. But I don't think that we can therefore say he's representative of some ancient past. It's an interesting custom, don't get me wrong, and it's really cool that they've represented it. And it because it's a seasonal custom and it's an old tradition, I do think that's quite cool that it's being preserved and continued. But I think that we do need to be aware of where these things sort of come from. But what about the Green Man? Where does this leave him, if it leaves him anywhere at all? Now, if Centerwall is right, then the Green Man Whiffler was a version of the Folliate head. We've discussed this. But the thing is, this is the thing that keeps tickling at the back of my brain. So if the Green Man represents the carvings, it doesn't necessarily mean that the carvings themselves represent the start of summer, because obviously they would be put in the church pretty much at any time. But, and this is where the but comes in, if we actually look at the origins of the Folliate head, what do we find? They're representing Roman gods and nature spirits. Now, we can't say that the Folliate head was ever actually intended as a form of worship of these beings. We can't say that at all, because, as I say, we don't know why they were put in there, because they do predate the Green Man at the pageant. So it's not like the carvings are to commemorate the pageants because the carvings came first. But they do represent these nature spirits nonetheless. So even if the Green Man of the pageant doesn't represent an ancient nature god, the Folliate heads are at least a distant relative of the nature spirits beloved by the Romans. So while we can't say that the Jack and the Green of English custom is anything to do with a nature god, we can say that there is perhaps some kind of descendant present in the churches through the form of these Folliate heads, even if they weren't actually intended to worship nature spirits or ancient gods. They were at least commemorating the Roman art that was intended to worship them. So I hope that's not too confusing to follow. I hope you found out a little bit about the Jack and the Green. As I say, there won't be this year, but there are some places in England that do still do the processions. As I say, I've never seen them up north, although I have seen Morris men. It was hilarious once. I was in a pub in Newcastle opposite the Castle Keep, and I was just sitting having a drink with someone, and a bunch of Morris men came in and started practicing their routine with the swords in the middle of the bar. That was weird. Anyway, that is the end of this week's episode. As I say, I hope you found it interesting. I hope you're not disappointed to find that the Green Man Folliate heads are not necessarily evidence of pagan worship among like stonemasons or anything, but look at them as what they are, that they're representative of the Roman masks that represented these nature spirits. And they're just also an example of good workmanship as well. So you can still enjoy them. As I say, just try and bear in mind all these different links have been put together by people who aren't necessarily looking at evidence. They're just looking at what's in front of them and making assumptions, much like what we looked at last week with the Easter link, that really Bede and Grimm were literally just working on linguistics, not any archaeological evidence. So, you know, it doesn't hurt to have an open mind. I'm absolutely not crapping on the idea of ancient nature gods or anything like that. And I love the idea that, you know, these spirits are commemorated in some form. But as I say, just possibly not the way that we think they are. So, yeah. That's the end of this week's episode. Next week, we're looking at the Persephone myth. So we will be looking at someone related to the beginning of spring and the onset of summer. You've probably heard it before, so I'm going to try and approach it from slightly different angles if I can. So I hope that you'll come back next week. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you soon. Cheerio.